to do this talk. And I want to thank everyone for taking the time to show up and also say Happy Black History Month, y'all. Even though this is something that some people are trying to erase, Happy Black History Month. Amen. So before we get started, I want to ask Meredith Clark, who, as you all know, is the foremost authority on Black Twitter. I want to ask you your definition of it, and I also want to read a definition, part of a definition that you offer in the book that I think is so succinct and so important. So you say that Black Twitter is the information product of a generation whose parents and grandparents found their reality absent from the mainstream press. It is the digital manifestation of our ability to use the master's tools as our ancestors did to tell our own stories, presenting them in a spatial, temporal, and social site that disrupts mainstream media narratives about Black life in America. That is a really deep and profound definition, but this is the one that I like the best. It is the great-grandchild of Freedom's Journal, Ebony and Essence's grandbaby, the daughter of Live Journal and Black Planet. Black Twitter is what happens when Black people become the victors who write their own stories. So can you talk to us about how you came up with these definitions and even why you wanted to study Black Twitter?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, and thank you everyone for being here. And thank you for reading that. It's so interesting to hear other people read your words. You know, you write a book, you're listening to your own voice all this time, so to hear someone else say it just rings differently.
You hear how good you are.
It sounds good. It sounds good. No, but back to the question about what Black Twitter is. Initially, the conversation was Black Twitter is just Black people using Twitter in the ways that we do it. So not code switching, not being any different than we normally would if you were with us in a close space. Now, for research purposes, I defined it as a group of culturally linked communicators using Twitter to talk about issues of concern to Black folks in everyday life. But that in itself still doesn't get to the richness and the diversity that is within Black Twitter, which reflects some of, but not all of the diversity of Black people as a whole. And as a journalist, a recovering journalist, I wanted to make sure that this story was recorded for posterity, because we see so often, we're seeing it right now, our history is very easily erased by people who are in positions of power. And one of the places that this manifested for me as I was working on this book was actually during the presidential election pretty early on, when we saw Nikki Haley claim to have taken down the Confederate flag in South Carolina as though it was something that she did herself, totally erasing someone's work like Bree Newsom, who climbed the flagpole and brought the flag down in the name of our ancestors. And so it's important to make sure that these stories are committed to the record so that no matter who owns the platform, we know where the stories are, who told them, and how they told them. So that's how this came to be. I have a similar question for you, my friend. So you come from the journalism world. You've written for magazines, you've written for newspapers, you were in the digital space. How and when did you decide to focus your attention on how Black folks were watching television and tweeting along with it?
This is an interesting question, because when I went to graduate school, I wanted to study how immigrant women in particular were using media like television and newspapers to learn English, right? And I also wanted to get an idea of, while they're using, because I was at this English as a second language class working with some adult students, English language learners. And one woman was telling me how she used to watch Sesame Street with her child to learn English. And I said, well, what about the other shows you watch? And what messages did you get from them? Because a lot of them were anti-immigrant, a lot of them were xenophobic. But then on Sunday nights, my dear friend Lynessa Williams and I were watching not Love and Hip Hop, but The Real Housewives of Atlanta. So we're watching The Real Housewives of Atlanta on the TV screen, and we're also on our laptops doing homework, because you know how you have like two windows open. We're doing homework, and we're also looking at the Twitter screen. But one night, I see like all of the top 10 trending topics are dominated by The Real Housewives of Atlanta. And I don't remember exactly what they were, but there are some of the classics like Bye Ashy, when Portia told Kenya that she had ashy feet. The Old Lady Gang, when Candy's mother and all of them got upset about her marriage to Todd. And just all of these things were trending, and I just felt like there is something to this. And also looking in the stream, I saw that there were people advertising things through there, whether it was waist trainers, the tummy tea, the tummy tea, just all these different things, hair bundles, just all these different types of things. So I started paying attention when other shows started coming on, and just really took it from there. And I screenshotted everything, and I still screenshot everything. I have like more than 12,000 images on my phone right now, because I just keep up with all the memes that happen. But it was really just being observant and seeing what was happening in real time.
So I think it's one thing for a person to observe what's happening in real time, but it's another to put years of work behind writing a book about Black people live tweeting television. Tell us a little bit about the reception that you got when you said, this is a topic that I want to work on, that I want to spend my academic scholarly time on, in a space that isn't always known for its reception of creative projects.
Yeah, some people thought it was frivolous. Like, Sherry, you're smart. You know about a lot of things. Why are you caring about tweeting and TV, and especially reality TV? Like, some people actually thought it was silly. But I'll be honest, and I'm really being totally honest here. When I saw the work that you started doing and showing, and when your work started to get more attention, it was really affirming for me. And also the work that other Black scholars like Andre Brock and Sophia Noble, all the work that all these other Black scholars were doing, not particularly about Twitter, but also just about Black people's use in the digital space, showed me that this is something that is worthy of study. And plus, when people tell you not to do stuff, that makes you really want to do it anyway.
Heard, felt. One other question I want to ask you about some of the background that you bring to this work. You've studied digital activism and particularly online activism by Black feminists. Tell us a little bit about how the work of Black feminists in particular shows up in this book.
Okay, so in my book in particular, and I want to ask you about this too in yours, because you have a whole chapter about it. But in my book in particular, I write about how Black feminists were really inching their way into the conversation about television to talk about a lot of other things that were important. So I don't know how many of you remember the show Being Mary Jane with Gabrielle Union, about a woman who was a television broadcaster. But while there were conversations about what was going on the show, there were also AIDS activists who were interjecting into that conversation and saying, I hope she's being safe. She has multiple partners. This is okay. This is cool, but make sure you're being safe at the same time. When I was watching the stream for Love and Hip Hop on Mondays, which people call Ratchet Mondays, I was seeing that there was a domestic violence advocate, anti-domestic violence advocate, who was saying that, yes, these couples are clashing. Some of these arguments do turn into physical fights, but we want you to know that you can get help. And even though this is the kind of relationship that you see on screen, this is not #relationship goals. So there are a lot of different ways that Black feminists were taking advantage of the conversations and of all those eyes that were on those tweets to enter the conversation. And I think that's something that's really important. One last thing that I want to mention too, people may remember Empire as a show that had a lot of social TV currency, but there's this writer, Cecily Bowen, who when Gabby Sidibe, when she was on there and she had a love scene, she is a plus size Black woman. When she had a love scene, people were, they were it seemed like they were really upset about it and honestly disgusted by it, because how dare this fat black woman not only be the object of affection, but also be in a hot, sexy love scene with a hot, sexy man. And Cecily intervened into that conversation and did this hashtag my fat black sex story. And she talked about fat black women's sex lives in ways that we hadn't really seen before. So when I think about the work of black women in particular, I see them not only raising important conversations, but also providing necessary awareness that people need surrounding some of the themes of these shows. Thank you. Can I ask you a question now?
Sure, absolutely.
So one of my favorite parts of this book is when we get down to the theory of it all, which might be boring for some people, but I really appreciated it.
Y'all see how Sherry pulled up here with the book. She's embarrassing. Professor Williams with the book and her notes.
I've also been wearing glasses since I was 5, so if I try to look on my phone, I won't be able to see it. But so on page 36, you talk about black digital resistance, and I really love this phrase, and I think it accurately captures what black people are doing online. But you say that at its essence, it is the practice of unapologetically living out our existence as black people, sometimes in the intentional defiance of the white gaze, and using social media technology to create, communicate, and build with one another as we exist in disparate physical, social, and economic spaces. So regardless of the medium, so this book is about Black Twitter, but can you talk about Black digital resistance as it might manifest on other platforms?
Absolutely. So when I think about Black digital resistance, first of all, I think about Black existence, period, as a form of resistance, and that is resisting the domination that has been part of our story ever since we were brought to these shores, to this country. And so just deciding to wake up, show up, and be who you are on a day-to-day is a form of resistance for me. Then to go into the digital space where you really can be anyone or anything, and we know that people play racial tourism, as Lisa Nakamura says, that they pretend to be people that they aren't. To choose to be Black in that space is another form of resistance. And so whether we are playing and having a good time, or we are protesting or drawing attention to some of the issues of concern for our communities, I think about that as ongoing resistance praxis. And you see it across a number of different platforms. Like before Twitter was a thing, and we go way, way back, I wanna say 2006, maybe keep me honest though, when the Jena 6 were suspended, expelled from their school for a fight that had happened, the place that we were organizing marches across the country to show solidarity with these kids in a high school in Jena, Louisiana, was online, to think about how can we connect with them? How can we show them that they're supported, so that you're not just a kid going through something at your high school in Louisiana, you are connected to this larger community of people who are standing up for you. So if your parent can't come down in the middle of the workday and say that they support you, or they can't stand for you at the school board meeting, know that there are literally hundreds of thousands of people who are showing up in these spaces. And that happens across platforms. We continue to see that even right now today. Folks are boycotting Target and other businesses that have been rolling back their DEI practices. And so you see conversations about those boycotts that have been networked and are being shared across platforms. It's on Facebook, it's on Twitter, which I'm always gonna call Twitter. It's never going to be anything else. It's on Instagram. You know, I haven't checked into the Clubhouse in a while, but it's there. And so we use these tools in ways that they may not have been intended, they may not have been designed, but we use them for our benefit.
So again, our books are about Twitter. I talk about how some of this social media activity around television has migrated to other spaces. Where are you seeing people go now that folks have, I don't want to call it a mass exodus because some people are still there, but since Elon Musk took over Twitter, there has been like Black Twitter is not the same anymore. So can you talk about the changes and where you see people going now?
Absolutely. So I first asked this question as part of the research in 2022, 2023, just to see where people were going. And at that time, people were still on Twitter. They weren't leaving, but they weren't checking it the same way. So some of the places where people have gone, they've gone back to their old Facebook pages. My Facebook in particular, personally, has seen a resurgence of people. Folks I haven't seen in years are back on Facebook. But they're also on Instagram, and I think one of the most interesting spaces that I've seen thus far is where people are adopting the Twitter practices on Threads. So Threads being the kind of the Twitter killer or the Twitter successor. They're showing up on Threads, and I know that it's folks from Black Twitter because when someone does something that's out of turn, they're like, no. Keep that mess on Twitter. We don't do that over here, all right? We don't do that. They're definitely on platforms like Spill. I know you write extensively about Spill. You like Spill. Girl, you gotta have, there's a learning curve to Spill, but I admire y'all and wanna be a Spillionaire one day. I said Instagram. I'm trying to think if there's anywhere else. Oh, definitely YouTube. We often leave out YouTube when we think about social media platforms and where people are, but that is where we saw the genesis of careers like Quinta Brunson's, like Issa Rae's, and people are still creating in that space. And then, of course, you're seeing us in podcasts. I know people don't think about that as digital and social media, but I definitely do, that more people are picking up the mic, for better or for worse. Some of y'all need to put the mics down. But they are broadcasting and narrating our lives in those spaces as well.
So I want to ask you this question because I'm sure the audience is really curious about it too. And it's the title of your book, We Tried to Tell Y'all, Black Twitter and the Rise of Digital Counter-Narratives. So in your book, you talk about cancel culture and also accountability culture. And Black Twitter has been a site where Black people have done a lot of accountability culture. So talk a little bit about that piece in the ways that like Black Twitter has held people accountable for the things that they have done and why you chose that as the title.
Okay. Let me answer the title part first. So I wrote headlines for a living as a journalist. That was like my first job. I was a copy editor. Shout out to the copy desk. And I was okay at it, but not necessarily great at it. So coming up with a book title, I'm like, how do I summarize what Black Twitter has been doing for all of these years? And there was someone on Twitter, this is a colloquialism within Black communities, like your mother says this to you, elders say this to you, your friends say this to you. Like, I tried to tell you, you wouldn't listen to me, but okay. But there was also a tweet that a writer put out, Clint, and I know I'm gonna blank on his last name, but he wrote the book, How the Word is Passed, and he tweeted this and said, it's an African-American proverb. And I was thinking about it one day while we were preparing for a panel at South by Southwest. And I'm just looking over my notes, and I'm like, we tried to tell y'all. And this was long before our current president was seated. This was long before Elon Musk bought the platform. It's just like there are so many things that Black people over the years have tried to tell larger society, like racism is not going to continue to benefit you. There's going to be an end to this, and you are actually suffering. So I just thought it was a great title, and it's something that people can easily relate to, and hopefully they'd be pulled in by it. Coming back to your question about cancel culture, though, I actually push back against that label. News media has this thing where we reinterpret phenomena in shorter terms so that it's catchier and it's easier for people to understand. So you can't take something like digital accountability practice and put that in a headline. It's not gonna work. But if you say cancel culture, people know what it means to be canceled. They know what culture is and how it's produced, so it's easy. I push back against that label because in the same way that things that have cultural context that come out of Black Twitter have a very specific meaning, that label cancel culture is doing the kind of work that we now see terms like woke and DEI are doing, that they're being repurposed and reconfigured and reconceptualized in ways that they were never intended. So when Black folks talked about canceling each other on social media, we were talking about holding people accountable. The story that I use in the chapter about cancel culture opens with Russell Simmons tweeting this video about Harriet Tubman and how she is supposed to be seducing her master to blackmail him. And he says it's the funniest thing that he's ever seen. And Black Twitter went off and snatched Russell Simmons' ball, but Russell Simmons is already bald. But really gave Russell Simmons a run for his money, and he had to apologize within a day. It's something he said he had never done. But we saw that practice over and over and over again. It came out of activist circles. We saw it come out of Black queer communities. And then that language got repurposed by people that it was never intended for. So politicians said that they were being canceled. Funny, you're still holding office. Celebrities said that they were being canceled. That's hilarious. You're still getting roles and making millions of dollars. How are you canceled? So I push back against that, but I think it goes to show just how powerful Black culture is, that it is appropriated and used for explaining how people interact in ways that were never intended.
So now I want to move and talk about some of the fun things that we might remember from Black Twitter. So when you think of not just the past, and I mean, Black Twitter has like a long shelf life too. I think we're talking about not just one particular moment in time, but when you think about what some of your favorite aspects are that are like a little more lighthearted and funny, what comes to mind?
Well, I opened the book with Negro Solstice, the day that Black people got our special powers. Anything that's not supposed to be funny that we made into a joke, that's where I am. In the documentary, Andre Brock talks about how his favorite day on Twitter was the day that Yahoo News tweeted that Trump wants a bigger Navy, but someone transposed the B and the N on the keyboard, and so it said something a little bit different. And no one thinks that racial epithets are funny, but that was funny that day. The jokes were hilarious. The memes were great. But I want to ask you the same question, though, because you watch, as you said, Ratchet Mondays, right? On there with
Guilty.
the shows by Ashy, all the housewives and whatnot. What was the best day on Twitter for you?
There were many, but for me, the origination of Thanksgiving clapbacks, that was hilarious to me, because just the whole idea of when your family gets together and how, you know, there are little subtle digs that maybe your auntie is like, you still don't have a husband yet?
Do you need another plate?
Right. Do you need another plate? Do you still need to keep living with grandmama? I mean, which is just like all the clapbacks that you wish you could say to your elders and your cousins or whoever else that you didn't. That's something that that remains top tier for me. But honestly, like, some of the things that I really enjoyed the most were just like being able to, especially in grad school, which I don't want to bring the room down, but it's very solitary, it's very lonely, it's very exhausting, but being able to just plug in on Sunday evening for Real Housewives of Atlanta, or either, you know, Scandal on Thursdays, or, you know, any of those shows, and be able to really connect with people who it felt like talking to cousins. Because when I was hundreds of miles in several states away from my own family, it felt like family, much in the way that my grandmother and I would talk to each other on the phone during commercial breaks when long distance was 5 cents a minute, because it was cheaper for us to talk. I mean, it was that kind of closeness that I felt when I felt so lonely and so isolated.
I want to ask you about that connection, because there's a term that you coin in the book, social celebrity interaction gratification. And it's doing a lot of heavy lifting because
I know, I'm sorry.
in academic circles, right, in academic work, everything has to have a label. Everything has to have a label. It has to connect with theory that is there and existing. But what that means is something a little bit different. It's actually reaching out and being able to touch those celebrities. What does this look like in practice online?
So really what I was trying to do was, again, to connect to some of the theory because, you know, as an academic, that's what I'm supposed to do. But really in practice, it looks like someone having direct contact with their favorite singer or their favorite actor, or someone having immediate two-way interaction with a creator of a show. So, I mean, that's something that I experienced. Lena Waithe had this show, Boomerang, where they had this really important scene where it was basically a Me Too scene with the Eddie Murphy character who, from Boomerang, who was accused of being sexually inappropriate with several women at the job. And I just typed like, this is so important for us as Black people to have a conversation like this, because it really wasn't in the way that I felt like we should have had this conversation publicly. I hadn't seen it yet, and I did see it here, and this was well done. And Lena tweeted back to me and said, I'm really glad that this is how you saw it, because this is how I meant for it to happen. So, but this two-way conversation, it's more than just the fans appreciating the creators, it's also the creators having an opportunity to see how people are receiving their work, because there have been shows that have been changed in the middle of their course because they have seen the fans don't like this. There have been shows that have been stopped, like the final episodes have been shown at 3 a.m. because the network and the advertiser saw we don't need to be associated with this anymore, because it's not just good for our brand, it's not good for our bottom line, because that's all these companies really care about anyways, if it's going to make them money. But this whole process of having two-way communication that is direct, and not like when I was growing up in the 80s. You know, you could write a letter to NBC, to Brandon Tartikoff at NBC, and say, hey, I love Punky Brewster, please keep this on the air, right? And I would get maybe a standard form letter back. But now you can do that and maybe even get some feedback. But even if they don't communicate with you directly, they see it and they act on what they see.
On that note, what would you say is the most significant contribution Black Twitter has made via social viewing?
One of the things that I think is really important is something that April Reign did with some of her colleagues. And for people, you might remember that name. April Reign is the woman who started the Oscar So White hashtag. So when the team that started Game of Thrones wanted to start this show called Confederate, which was basically, it was a contemporary reimagination of what America would look like if slavery were a corporatized practice, right? So this was something that they were developing in 2017. So this is after the Muslim ban. This is after Charlottesville 2017. Heather Heyer is killed by white supremacists. They're on the campus carrying tiki torches. You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. This is after Dylan Roof goes to a church and kills elders on during Bible study. So many things had happened in the country that we were already experiencing white supremacy at its forefront. So this team of women were basically like, we don't need to see a fictional reimagination of this. So when Game of Thrones, on Sunday night, when people were tweeting about Game of Thrones, they started hashtagging No Confederate. It ended up being like the top trending topic in the United States. That's number 2 global trending topic. They continue to do this for weeks and weeks, and that show never aired.
All right, so stopping some development in its tracks, right?
Stopping it dead in its tracks.
Okay. I know that we're drawing close to time, but I want to ask you one last question. It's my favorite question to ask authors. What did you leave out of the book? What did you have to leave out?
there are a couple things when I think about that. One is some of the actual memes. And I'm really sorry that they couldn't make it. There was a problem with resolution and reprinting and all that kind of stuff. But this is visual, right? Social media is a very visual practice. And I really wish that people could have seen some of the memes. Like one of my favorite ones was when Scandal was on. Of course, you know, the plot and the twists were so, you know, amazing that people would feel like, oh my God, I'm gonna faint. So there was one, and my grandmother was on the usher board at her Baptist church, right? And so if you know anything about Black church culture, the usher board are the people, when people get the Holy Ghost, they'll come and, like fan you and tap you on your head and stuff like that. So there's this one meme that somebody created with all these older Black women in their usher board uniforms, and it said 1-800 I done fell out after watching Scandal, and I need the elders. And like that's something that I describe in the book, but if you had been able to see it, it would have just been much more effective. So some of the memes weren't able to make it in there. But another thing that I wish I would have been able to do, I got to do some, but I didn't have enough time, and that is to interview some of the influencers who are really pushing this, because there are regular people like me and others who just tweet when they watch TV, but then there are people who have like hundreds of thousands or maybe even 1 million followers, and they really do drive these conversations. And I wish I would have gotten a chance to talk to more of them, but I did get a chance to interview Kendall, who was really helpful in talking about his role as a social media influencer and how he tries to use his audience and his influence responsibly to gain traction for shows.
All right. So I think we are now ready to turn things over to our lovely audience. Thank you all for joining us today. What questions do you have?
Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm so excited about this program. Question about Black Twitter. Can't wait to read both of these. So this is sort of two questions. Should Black people be on Twitter? I mean, should we leave? I mean, what's just your informed, response to that, given what's going on? And do you have an idea of, since there has been, you did say there was sort of an exodus, like how has that changed Twitter? And I don't know if this goes beyond your research, but I'm just curious about that.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So when Elon Musk announced that he was actually being forced to buy Twitter, right? People said, that's it, I'm done, I'm out of here, pack it up, leave. And I think the most important message that I heard about what you should do in terms of whether you should stay on Twitter or leave Twitter when he purchased it was from the podcast Gaslit Nation. It's hosted by Andrea Chalupa and Sarah Kendzior. And one of the hosts said that you do not cede territory in an information war. And I'm gonna repeat that because I think it's very important. You do not cede territory in an information war. So Twitter was never a moneymaker in the way that Facebook was, in the way that Instagram is, but it's important. It's where journalists used to come to talk about their stories. It's where people were able to amplify what was going on the ground and tell a counter narrative that wasn't. I'm about to stop talking. The teacher in me is like, what? Okay. Folks at home, we're pausing for a little music in the background. Okay, so keep it going. All right, so talk a little louder. People are still on Twitter. The thing that makes Twitter difficult to use right now is that there's so much junk on the platform. But when you talk about not ceding territory in an information war, it doesn't mean that you necessarily pull up stakes and go home. It means that perhaps you stop using the platform, but you keep your account. You make sure that someone else can't take your name, squat on it, and post as though they were you. And this is a lesson I learned the hard way after getting locked out of my account and then seeing someone from Russia log into it. So if you have an account, the message is to stay there, to hold it, even if you're not using it, because this is a platform that is essential to communicating, at this point, a lot of mis and disinformation. And the more people who are still able to be there and get in and either directly confront that mis and disinformation, or at least not allow their accounts to be hijacked, the better.
I mean, I pretty much agree with that. I still have an account that is open, but I don't engage because really I just don't want to engage on a platform that is owned by someone who is like just outwardly white supremacist. But I mean, honestly, that's all of them though. But yeah, I'm just not on there like that because I just really don't want to be. I don't. But I do still have an account and I still check it sometimes.
Sherry, I was going to ask you if Abbott Elementary, which is kind of a favorite show of mine, is one that has had has been part of Black social television, and maybe you don't. I guess I really would just want to say, when I say Abbott Elementary on Black social television, does there anything in particular come to mind? Any commentary that people have had about the show or about any of the characters?
Well, I write about this show, so I have an entire chapter where I write about how Black people have taken all of these digital tools that were not really meant for us to create all of the content that we create, and they've been able to use it to bypass some of the traditional gatekeeping in Hollywood. So I write about how yes, thank you. I was about to say Issa Rae. Lord have mercy. How Quinta Brunson, started using iMovie to first start making movies and content and different things like that. So what I do is I talk about a lot of different content creators. I talk about Quinta Brunson. I talk about Issa Rae and also Justin Simien and all these people, Lena Waithe, how they started making shorts on social media first to just really kind of like test out the waters and show people the kind of content they wanted to make, kind of whet people's appetites. And then they continue to put out content on social media, and that really kind of helped them build an audience. So then when they did finally move on over to mainstream Hollywood and get more of a traditional platform, they already had a ready-made audience because they had already been creating content that people were loving, especially when we think about somebody like Issa Rae, who had Awkward Black Girl, which was exclusively on YouTube for years and years, and then transformed into Insecure and all of these other great things that she's doing in Hollywood now. But her training ground was really creating shorts that she started posting on Facebook when she was an undergrad.
I want to briefly add to that because one of the conversations that was really important that came from Abbott Elementary as people were reacting to it, people kept asking Quinta Brunson to have an episode about a school shooting. And that was something that was taking place on the platform, asking her directly, when are we going to get this episode about a school shooting? And she responded back there on the platform that she was not going to traumatize these children by making them relive the trauma that is very real in the world away from the keyboard. And I thought that was so important to show not only how a showrunner is listening to an audience, but also how they're able to advocate for what they are creating, the people that they are creating with, and whom they are creating it for. That not everything is up for entertainment. Not everything is going to be for your entertainment, even though we're listening to you and the kind of input you have about the show.
Hi, so thank you so much for your inspiring conversation today. And I'm Hyun-kyu. I also teach political communication at Howard. So it's been so interesting to hear what you're talking today. So my question is, with some current changes in platform in terms of their governance and with fewer content moderations, I was wondering what we could do to make our online space, especially social media, to become more safer space, especially for those who are coming from historically underserved communities?
This is a good question. It's also a tough question, and one that's been with us like since the beginning of social networking platforms. The designers of these platforms have always disproportionately left the protection of their users up to the users themselves. So you have to report someone who is harassing you before there's intervention. And often you report someone or you report abusive language or harmful images, and someone somewhere says, no, there's nothing wrong with this, continue to use the platform. One of the things that I took from the people that I interviewed for this book was the importance of curating your own community on these platforms. So following the things that you were interested in seeing and interacting with them so that you continue to see that kind of content, which becomes so much more important now that content moderation is being done away with. There's also, though, the strategic breaks that people take, that sometimes you do just have to step away from the phone, from the keyboard, and get out of that space because it can get incredibly toxic. The last thing I would say is probably using the tools that are there to the extent that they can be used to report that harmful behavior, even though I'm really discouraged with Twitter because at this point you're reporting harmful behavior and it's going absolutely nowhere. But finding your people and sticking by and with your people, I think something that comes out of Black Social TV, and will you pick up on this? One of the things that helped people to endure the harassment and the abusive language and images that they saw on TV was that you knew, or not on TV, but on these platforms, you knew that at a certain time, certain days of the week, you could find your people and that you could connect with them.
Agree with that, but since we don't have that much time, do you want to take one more question?
Thank y'all for coming, Meredith, Sherry. Y'all are amazing, sincerely. I also did want to piggyback on what you said, Meredith, real quick about Abbott Elementary. I did want to note that it was a primarily non-Black audience that was asking about the school shooting episode, and a lot of people on Black Twitter, especially Black fans of the show, just was like, this is a primarily Black school, you know, and that's just not appropriate. And Quinta Brunson came out and actually spoke those same sentiments, but I just wanted to make that note. My question is, in regards to the comments that you made about cancel culture, I don't really believe it's a thing either, so I agree with you there, and I did want to hear both of your notes, but older generations kind of glazed over many of the people who have caused harm to the community. Why do you both think it was easier for the younger generations to not only see these harmful behaviors, but openly call them out on Twitter?
Okay. One of the reasons I think that it was a little bit easier, one, because you knew you weren't alone. You knew that there were other people, and you knew that you weren't alone based on the affirmation. So one of the parts that I talk about with Black Digital Resistance is this affirmation. And it's not always agreement, but it is the recognition that others have for you when you are tweeting. So Bev Gooden was a woman who talked about why she didn't leave an abusive relationship. If you remember Ray and Janae Rice and how we saw this video of him assaulting her in a parking garage, and people say, well, why don't you leave? And Bev Gooden tweeted about why she didn't leave. And all of these women came forward and talked about how they felt like they couldn't leave their abusive relationships. And that sort of collectivity and that sort of support in a community, I think, makes it a lot easier to call out bad behavior. So whether the person is in the room with you or literally thousands of miles away, knowing that someone else has your back and has the ability to support you when you do that, I think helps a great deal in calling out harmful behavior.
I'm going to use personal privilege to ask a question. Sherry, you mentioned Punky Brewster, which pretty much identifies you as a Gen Xer like myself, because I immediately tapped in on that. We're part of the generation that saw newspaper reporters turn radio broadcasters, turn television. Then we saw television reporters who had to adapt to Twitter and Facebook and events of social media. I feel like right now we're starting to see the original content creators beginning to strike out on their own, where the sole focus of their work is content, 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 where they're beginning to get additional roles. I think we're starting, the Abbott Elementary example is one where we may have seen that cute little kid that we've known on TikTok, and all of a sudden she's now on an episode of Abbott. Can you talk, both of you talk about this next generation of content creators and the power that we're starting to see them wield in other media, including in politics? For us being here in DC, we've seen those content creators who are now side by side at Pebble Beach at the White House or at political conventions, and what that means for this next generation and their voice going forward.
So for one thing that I think is really good about social media and people being able to create their own content is that it has allowed them to really kind of not necessarily bypass, but maybe skate and jump around some of the traditional gatekeepers in Hollywood. Because I think about, I think her name is on social media, I think it's like That Girl Lele, who is this girl who she raps, she sings, she does all these great things. She's been funny, and I mean, I followed her for years. Now she has a show on Nickelodeon, you know, and she's on commercials. We see her everywhere. Like I mentioned, this person who I interviewed for the book, Kendall, he started out really just kind of criticizing some of the shows, right? And people would look forward to his critiques of the shows more than the actual shows, right? And then they started bringing him into the show, like when they would have the reunion show, when people would fight backstage, he would interview them. Robbie Reed, a famous casting director in Hollywood, liked his energy and booked him on a show that was on BET for 2 seasons. So this has been a way for people to get attention and really funnel their way into Hollywood. And I think that is particularly important for Black people because we don't always have the opportunity to go to a really high-level acting school or have a network of people in Hollywood who can really help us in like a lot of the nepotism like other people have. But we've been able to take these tools and just show our sheer talent, and we've been able to push through that way. And I think that's really important. And when we think about news too, I think it is important. I've seen like these conversations about news influencers and should they be properly trained? Should they get a certificate from Poynter or different things like that? But I mean, the fact is that, in no shade to them, you know, a little bit down the street, everybody is not getting their news from the Washington Post anymore. People are not waiting until 6 o'clock to watch Lester Holt. I mean, they want to get their news from Under the Desk News because they trust that journalist. They know that journalist. So, I mean, but it's also, if you have been trying to freelance for years, and if you've been trying to get bylines from legacy media, you don't have to worry about that anymore. You have the skills, you know how to tell a story, and you can just tell it directly to the audience that way. So I think that social media has been really important in helping people get their messages directly out into the public and not have to deal with the gatekeepers all the time.
Amen.
Thank you guys for your work and for your insights. I'm a recovering Twitter addict, so this is right up my alley. But I have a question related more to like your methods and how you did this work. So Dr. Williams, you mentioned screenshots. I imagine there you had to have some kind of like really careful organizing principle with that. But I'm also interested in like, did you use the Twitter API? Were you using the search? Like, how did you filter through all that info to find what you wanted to study?
Well, for me, this was like the Stone Age, okay? So I was just taking screenshots in real time and just taking those screenshots and then having them typing them all up and putting them into an Excel sheet and then transferring them over to NVivo and then doing like thematic analysis through NVivo. But I mean, this is like the Stone Ages, right? This is before, like, this is like the early 2010s, before a lot of the tools that are available now are available. So that's how I did it, which was really a lot of old-fashioned qualitative analysis.
I'll say just really briefly, you learn to take something like screenshots because you can use an API to do this sort of research and advanced programming interface, and I have that right, but it can be disabled with a keystroke. And I learned that the hard way during my dissertation, where I was using one of these tools to collect tweets, and then one day it was obsolete. So I did digital ethnography, and that included a bunch of interviews. It did include taking the screenshots as well, but also news narrative analysis alongside the cases that are talked about in the book. So lots and lots of qualitative research, both from Black feminist perspectives, so bringing those theories to bear on the work that we're doing.
And our last question.
Thank you so much. Come on, Black Girl Magic. This has been awesome. So we talked about the future of what it looks like for Black people leaving Twitter. We talked about Twitter itself. Like, I grew up on Twitter. I remember like 2012 as like the height of Black Twitter. But can we also talk about the past? And this is based on conversations I've had with you, Sherry. This is like a little intimate conversation we've had. But can you talk about advocacy before Black Twitter? Because this just didn't happen. Like, we got on Twitter and it's like, we're gonna advocate now to create positive images, right? We've always been doing this. So can both of you perhaps talk about that history?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So in the book, I definitely I frame Black social TV and the advocacy that has been done there as a part of a long line of history that Black people have done. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is how Black people, particularly when it comes to a film like Birth of a Nation, right? We know that Birth of a Nation is notoriously racist and dangerous and has been for us for a very long time, even though in film schools it's held up as like, you know, the standard for, you know, film technically and all that kind of stuff, but they never really analyzed the content. So there were people like Ida B. Wells and all these other folks, the NAACP, who were working to get Birth of a Nation like not shown in film houses across the country because they knew how dangerous it was. And there was actually a scholar who found that in the counties where Birth of a Nation was shown, not only did violence against Black people rise, but also KKK memberships also increased. So there are real consequences for stereotypical and white supremacist imagery of Black people. I think of someone like Mamie Till Mobley, who demanded that this country see what white racism had done to her son when she demanded that the picture of Emmett Till's bloated and beaten body be published in Jet magazine. That is a form of resistance. Even back in the 80s, there were protests that were happening, the NAACP, regular people, when there were shows that were coming out and there was not a single Black person in the cast, not as a principal, but in the cast period, there were protests and boycotts that were being called for. So there has always been a way that we have called for not only the protection, but the advocacy of better, authentic images of us, because we know that our images are often used as examples of perceived pathology, I think is probably the best way to put it. And because Black people know that our images are used against us, we are fiercely protective of them. And this digital advocacy, in terms of what we want to see on television, what we want to be taken off, is really part of a long line of really image warfare and image advocacy that Black people have done.
I would say really briefly, I wrote the book as a chapter of Black media history. The dissertation was titled To Tweet Our Own Cause, and that draws on the opening editorial from the first Black newspaper that was published by free Black men in the United States, where they said, we want to plead our own cause, that too often others have spoken for us. And I think about Black Twitter, whether it's via Black social TV or just tweeting and protests or what have you, as an extension of all the advocacy work that Black people have done through media over time. So just like Ida B. Wells recorded lynchings through the Red Record, we can hold up those hashtag memorials of people who were killed as a digital record, saying that we're not just letting go the fact that this person was killed through racialized violence. To me, what this is not so much a new thing, it is just the latest iteration of the phenomenon, and that's what's important about putting Black Twitter in its historical context.
Please give a hand to Drs. Clark and Williams. Just as a reminder, programs like this do not exist in a vacuum. We have fantastic partners, including the DC Public Library Foundation, which is funded by many of our philanthropic community. We are blessed that of the 700,000 DC residents, 300,000 of them are library card holders. That's a huge, huge index for a major metropolitan city. And it can only help when you get a library card and use your library card, and encourage others here within to use the library